In late December 2025, a quiet but powerful unrest began to ripple through Iran's streets. The air was tense, heavy with uncertainty, as the city of Tehran seemed to hold its breath. Unlike previous uprisings, there were no immediate crowds or slogans, just a sense that something fundamental had shifted. It started not with the roar of protest, but with silence. Shopkeepers in Tehran, the heart of Iran's commerce, refused to open their doors. Their shutters stayed down, sending a message that echoed through the city, a silent strike against a collapsing economy and a government that seemed unable to help. Prices for everyday goods soared overnight. The cost of bread, rice, and medicine became almost impossible for many families to afford. The rial, Iran's currency, lost value by the day, and shelves in grocery stores grew emptier as imports dried up. Parents worried about feeding their children, and the elderly wondered how they would pay for basic medicine. Shopkeepers, squeezed by rising costs and dwindling customers, felt the pressure mounting. Many had run their businesses for generations, but now they faced ruin. Their decision to close was not just about money. It was a desperate plea for change, a way to say that enough was enough. The rial's value had crashed to historic lows, 1.4 million rials for a single US dollar. This made imported goods nearly impossible to buy, and even local products became unaffordable. For many, daily life became a struggle for survival, with every purchase a painful calculation. Years of international sanctions, government mismanagement, and corruption had brought Iran to this breaking point. The country's oil wealth, once a source of pride, now seemed distant and inaccessible, as infrastructure crumbled and public trust eroded. This wasn't Iran's first protest over economic hardship. The country had seen waves of unrest before, but this time the desperation ran deeper. People remembered past promises of reform that never materialized, and hope was wearing thin. The strike in Tehran's bazaars was more than a local event. It echoed the pain of millions across the country. The empty streets and shuttered shops were a visible sign that patience was running out, and that the people's suffering could no longer be ignored. President Masoud Pezeshkian, a reformist who had promised change, now faced the greatest challenge of his career. The eyes of the nation were on him, waiting to see if he could deliver on his promises, or if he would become another leader unable to stem the crisis. Protesters weren't calling for revolution, at least, not yet. Their demands were clear: lower prices, a stable currency, and a real hope for the future. They wanted action, not empty words, and they were prepared to keep pushing until they saw results. The shopkeepers' quiet defiance was like a spark in a dry field, threatening to ignite a nationwide fire. Their courage inspired others, and soon, whispers of protest began to spread beyond Tehran. Their message was simple but urgent: fix the economy, or face a much larger crisis. The government could no longer ignore the pain and anger simmering just below the surface. In the days ahead, the world would watch as that spark threatened to become a blaze, and the true extent of the people's resolve would be revealed. The strike in Tehran quickly became a national movement. By December 30th, university students joined in, bringing new energy and political demands. Protests erupted in cities like Lordagan, Marvdasht, and Zahedan. Economic grievances gave way to bold calls for political change, even direct criticism of Supreme Leader Khamenei. The movement echoed the scale and intensity of the 2022 Woman Life Freedom Uprising. Discontent was no longer regional, it was nationwide. Protesters now demanded not just economic relief, but freedom and a new direction for Iran. Faith in the current system had collapsed. The protests became a direct challenge to the Islamic Republic's foundation. Iran was at a crossroads, with millions demanding real change. As protests swelled, the energy in the streets became electric. People from all walks of life, young and old, men and women, joined together, united by a shared sense of frustration and hope for change. The city pulsed with chants and the glow of cell phone lights as thousands demanded their voices be heard. But as the crowds grew, so did the government's crackdown. Security forces moved in swiftly, determined to stamp out the unrest before it could spread further. What began as peaceful marches quickly spiraled into chaos. Cars burned in the streets, thick smoke billowed into the night sky, and the sound of shouting was punctuated by the clash of shields and batons. The city, once alive with hope, now echoed with fear and confusion. By January 2nd, at least 8 people had been killed across several cities. Sirens wailed as emergency vehicles rushed through the chaos, and the aftermath left families and communities reeling from shock and loss. Each death deepened the nation's grief and anger. Candlelight vigils sprang up overnight, with mourners gathering to honor the fallen and demand answers. Conflicting reports about the victims fueled mistrust. Some were labeled as security forces, others as ordinary protesters. The truth became harder to find, as rumors and official statements clashed in the media. Families disputed official accounts, insisting their loved ones were innocent. Many accused authorities of covering up the real circumstances of the deaths, refusing to accept the government's version of events. Funerals became flashpoints for further unrest. What should have been moments of mourning turned into new protests, as crowds chanted for justice and accountability at gravesides. The government tried to control the narrative, holding press conferences and issuing statements, but protesters fought to reveal the truth, using social media and word of mouth to share their stories. The battle for justice played out both in the streets and in the stories told about the dead. Memorials and graffiti became symbols of resistance, while journalists risked their safety to document the unfolding tragedy. The divide between people and government grew wider with every loss. Trust eroded, and the sense of separation became almost physical, visible in the barriers and the faces of those on either side. In Iran, even the truth about a death became a battleground, a struggle not just for justice, but for the right to be heard and remembered. The government's response was two-faced. President Pezeshkian acknowledged the economic pain, promising action and empathy. He urged peaceful protest and vowed to address hardship, hoping to calm the streets. But alongside this, officials issued harsh warnings. Illegal gatherings and unrest would be met with zero tolerance. Prosecutors threatened severe punishment for anyone arrested. The message was clear. Dialogue was possible, but force was ready. This dual approach left Iranians uncertain. Would they be met with reform or repression? The government walked a tightrope, trying to appear reasonable while preparing for a crackdown. The nation waited, unsure which face of power would prevail. As Iran's crisis deepened, former U.S. President Donald Trump entered the fray. On January 2nd, he posted a blunt warning to Iran's leaders on social media. Trump threatened that if Iran violently suppressed protesters, the U.S. was locked and loaded and ready to act. He didn't specify what action he meant, military, economic, or otherwise, leaving the threat open-ended. This was a dramatic break from typical diplomatic caution. Trump's words emboldened some protesters and alarmed Iranian officials. For the U.S., it was a high-stakes move, instantly raising the crisis to an international level. Iran's internal struggle was now a global flashpoint. The world watched, uncertain what would come next. Locked and loaded is a military term. Trump's message was no empty threat. The phrase signaled U.S. military readiness, recalling past American strikes on Iran's nuclear sites. Iran's leaders knew Trump had acted before, making his warning credible. Yet, he left his intentions vague. Would the U.S. strike, sanction, or support protesters? This ambiguity forced Iran to consider worst-case scenarios, increasing pressure on Tehran. Despite the rhetoric, U.S. troop levels in the region didn't change. The threat was psychological as much as military, a tool to deter violence without immediate action. Trump's words aimed to protect protesters by making Iran's leaders fear the consequences. The world waited to see if the threat would work. In this high-stakes game, words alone could shift the balance. Iran's leaders fired back at Trump's warning with threats of their own, making it clear that they would not be intimidated by American rhetoric. The atmosphere in Tehran grew tense as officials gathered to craft a unified response, determined to show strength both to their own people and the world. Top officials condemned U.S. interference, warning it would destabilize the region and endanger American interests. They accused Washington of meddling in Iran's internal affairs, and insisted that such actions would only fuel further unrest and violence. Ali Larijani, head of Iran's National Security Council, went further, directly threatening U.S. troops stationed throughout the Middle East. He warned that if America intervened, its forces would face severe consequences, and that Iran would not hesitate to defend itself with all available means. Other officials echoed these sentiments, declaring that Iran's security was a red line. Any U.S. action, they said, would be met with force, and the country would stand united against foreign aggression. The government's message was one of defiance and readiness. The Speaker of Parliament issued a stark warning. All U.S. bases in the region could become targets if hostilities escalated. This was not just political posturing. It was a signal that Iran was prepared to take real action if provoked. Iran's history of retaliation, like the missile strike on Al Udeid Air Base, made these threats real. The world had seen before how quickly tensions could spiral into open conflict, and Iran's military capabilities were on full display. The message was clear: any intervention would mean war. Both sides seemed to be preparing for the worst, with military assets mobilizing and the risk of miscalculation growing by the day. Internally, Iran's state media seized on Trump's words, using them to paint the protests as part of a foreign plot orchestrated by the U.S. This narrative was pushed relentlessly, aiming to rally nationalist sentiment and discredit the demonstrators. This justified a harsher crackdown, as authorities claimed they were defending the nation from outside interference. The government tried to turn public opinion against the demonstrators, portraying them as pawns of hostile powers rather than citizens demanding change. The standoff escalated, with both sides raising the stakes. Diplomatic channels grew colder, and the threat of a wider conflict loomed over the region, making the situation increasingly volatile. The protests were now entangled in a dangerous international showdown, with ordinary Iranians caught in the crossfire of a high-stakes geopolitical struggle. For Iranian protesters, Trump's threat brought mixed emotions. Some felt emboldened, believing U.S. attention might shield them from violence. A young woman told the BBC that Trump's reputation for action made security forces hesitate. For these protesters, any outside support was a lifeline. But many analysts warned Trump's intervention could backfire. The government now had an excuse to brand the movement as a U.S.-backed conspiracy. This could justify a brutal crackdown and sway public opinion. Protesters found themselves caught between hope for help and fear of harsher repression. The stakes had never been higher. In Iran, hope and danger walked hand in hand. The world watched as Iran teetered on the edge. A violent crackdown could trigger U.S. intervention and regional chaos. War would disrupt oil supplies, spike prices, and cause immense suffering across the Middle East. Yet, restraint and dialogue could open a path to reform and de-escalation. International calls for calm and Iran's hints at negotiation offered a glimmer of hope. The choices made in Tehran and Washington would ripple far beyond Iran's borders. The fate of millions, and the peace of a volatile region, hung in the balance. The coming days would decide whether Iran's crisis ended in tragedy or transformation. The world held its breath, waiting for history to unfold.